Good morning everyone and welcome to the Equal Opportunity Committee's 16th meeting of 2013. Can I remind everyone to turn all electronic devices to either flight mode or switch them completely off. Round the table today, along with members and witnesses, are the Clerking and Research Team, Official Report and Broadcasting Services, and around the room we are supported by the Security Office. My name is Mary Fee and I'm the committee convener. Other committee members will now introduce themselves in turn. Marco.
I'm Marco Biaggi, MSP for Edinburgh Central and Deputy Convener.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
And the new member of the Scottish Parliament, Christian Allard, for the North East of Scotland.
Alec Johnston, member from North East Scotland.
Good morning, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
Thank you. Agenda item 1 today is a declaration of interests. In accordance with section 3 of the Code of Conduct, I invite Christian Allard to declare any interests relevant to the committee's remit. Any declaration should be brief but sufficiently detailed to make clear the nature of the interest. Christian.
I declare an interest, member of REACH, the Association for Children with Upper Limb Deficiency. My daughter was born with only one arm 20 years ago, so I've been a member of this charity for 20 years.
That. Agenda item 2 is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to agree whether to take item 5 on the agenda on forthcoming legislation on marriage and civil partnerships in private. Are we agreed? Thank you.
Is it 5 or 4?
It's 5. It's 5. The papers, the numbers I think changed. Okay.
It says 4 on here.
I bet it's actually 5, yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Agenda item 3 this morning is ministerial evidence on women in work, and can I welcome Angela Constance, the Minister for Employment. And can I also welcome our other witnesses? Can I ask that you introduce yourselves?
My name is Julie Bellotti. I work in the Employability Policy Team in the Scottish Government. Susan Bolt from the Early Learning and Childcare Team in the Scottish Government.
Flanagan from the Scottish Government's Equality Unit.
Thank you. Can I now ask Angela Constance, the Minister, to make her opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, colleagues. I very much welcome the opportunity to appear before committee today, to take this opportunity to discuss issues facing women in Scotland, whether they are looking for or are already in work. I know that in gathering your evidence for the inquiry, a number of clear themes have emerged, and these very much echo the topics raised and discussed so enthusiastically at last year's Women's Employment Summit. I believe strongly that tackling these challenges requires us all to work closely together in all levels of government and indeed across all aspects of Scottish society. And I want to be clear that wherever we can, the Scottish Government is determined to drive long-term change to help all of Scotland's women fulfil their potential. On childcare, the Children and Young People Bill introduced to Parliament on the 17th of April contains provisions to increase the amount and the flexibility of early learning and childcare. This represents a significant step to achieve our ambition of developing a high-quality, universal system of early learning and childcare that is affordable and flexible and meets the needs of all children, parents and families. The First Minister has indicated that a transformational shift in childcare at all levels should be one of the first tasks of an independent Scotland. And to support this, he has asked the Council of Economic Advisers to consider options for delivering and funding a high-quality, universal early learning and childcare system in Scotland, along with the associated social and economic impacts and benefits. Occupational segregation, another issue raised in your inquiry, affects society as a whole, and addressing it requires societal change. At last year's Women's Employment Summit, the First Minister announced CareerWise, an initiative which will run over 2 years and which will help us understand what we can do to encourage more young women to pursue careers in STEM. But occupational segregation is a much wider challenge than issues in and around STEM. It's also about valuing the sectors that women are traditionally drawn to, making sure career opportunities are open to all, enabling young people to understand the nature of the labour market and how to make informed choices, and for employers to recognise the economic and social value of a balanced workforce. And this very much requires a cross-government approach, and we have reconvened the Cross-Directorate Occupational Segregation Working Group to consider the potential action we can take on with regards to the recommendations both from the Women's Employment Summit and the Royal Society of Edinburgh's report, Tapping All Our Talents. Last year's Summit on Flexible Working highlighted good practice across both the public and private sectors. We can't force private sector's employers to adopt flexible working practices, but we can encourage change and lead by example. So that's why we sponsored the Institute of Directors to introduce a new award recognising flexible and family-friendly working practices as part of their annual awards ceremony. In particular, it's important, we believe, to encourage information sharing and peer mentoring between big businesses and those small and medium-sized enterprises who often feel unable to offer flexible working opportunities because they feel it will affect the running of their business. So we are exploring this now, and we'll welcome any thoughts that the committee may have. Now, with regards to enterprise, although the numbers are rising, women still account for only 14% of SME employers and 30% of self-employed people. And last September's summit was a catalyst for a series of seminars between October and April, covering a range of areas for action, including effective networking and the celebration of role modelling of women in enterprise. Professor Sarah Carter, who led the discussion on women in enterprise at the summit, has led all of these seminars and is bringing together recommendations for practical actions for the government to pursue. Convener, I haven't had time in this short address to cover all the activity across government following the Women's Employment Summit last year, but it is important to stress that I did not see this as a one-off event. I most certainly did not see it as a talking shop, and that we very much now have to pursue follow-up actions. And to make sure that we keep an emphasis on this priority area, I have convened a small group who will help me monitor action across government and offer advice on policy development, and I intend to report fully to Parliament on progress later this year. So in conclusion, Convener, the summit last year was just the first step, and we very much recognise that at this point in time we don't have all the answers, and that's why we very much welcome this inquiry and look forward to discussing the key issues and themes today, and to consider further how we might all work together for a common goal.
Thank you, Minister, for those very welcome opening remarks. I'm going to move now to questions from committee members, and I'm going to start with Marco Biaggi, who has questions around childcare, and then move to John Mason, who wants to cover the issue of schools. Marco.
Thank you, Convener. For better or worse, the reality of our society is that the majority of childcare responsibilities fall on women. So in light of that, do you think that how much do you think the Children and Young People Bill's changes will help, especially in light of the UK government's changes to childcare funding through tax credits?
In terms of, I recognise the, in theory, we all want childcare to be an issue for all parents. For the concerns and issues to apply equally to men and women. Of course, I think the reality is in today's society that lack of affordable, accessible childcare in reality will have a far greater impact on women's participation in the labour market than men, and I don't think that's a controversial statement. In terms of changing perceptions in and around that, because I believe, childcare should be an issue for parents, for both men and women. I think the National Parenting Strategy, I hope, will help, to carve out a different culture and to change attitudes in that regard. In terms of where we are now, I think the Children and Young People's Bill is a very important and substantial step in terms of how we deal with our infrastructure. And I think at a very practical level, we are starting in the right place. We are capitalising on a universal service that's currently available to all 3- and 4-year-olds in terms of access to preschool provision, and we're trying to ramp up the provision of the hours. And if you look at from 2007 till next year, that will be a 45% increase in the hours when the 600 hours commitment is introduced. So for me, the Children and Young Persons Bill is the right place to start. I believe it's right. I know there are many options, there are many places that we could have started, but I think for practical reasons it was best for us to start with 3- and 4-year-olds. The UK government's proposed changes, I suppose that there's been a lot of debate about the impact of welfare reforms on equality groups and women in particular. In terms of UK government changes with regards to the recent budget statement, I mean, a lot of that is still quite unclear in terms of the tax credits. At this stage, it would appear to me that will benefit not those people on the lowest income, but will disproportionately affect those on greater incomes. But we'll look more closely at the detail as that follows. I know, as committee will be, there's been a debate with regards to provision for 2-year-olds. There have been different changes or proposed changes down south. I think in terms of the way forward that the Scottish Government is pursuing, we don't want to compromise on the quality of that childcare, and maintaining child ratios are very important to us.
That slightly preempts my next question, which was going to be to contrast the Scottish and English approaches to this. But perhaps you could give your view on the issue that has really come up in evidence about a universal approach versus a more targeted approach, and why the universal approach that's been taken is, in your view, the right one at this stage.
I think, given that our aspiration is for a universal early learning and childcare system, I mean, that's what we're aiming for. That's what we want to, make steps towards. That's what we're striving for. For me, it's common sense that we start with a universal approach. And I know there are many debates around that. I think the benefits of a universal approach to childcare and early learning for all children is preferable, as opposed to, and understand arguments about a more targeted approach. But I believe, in terms of work with very young children, it's important not to have stigmatised services. So in terms of building that change and culture and aspiration that we have for a society, we want a universal childcare system, and I think we should start as we mean to go on.
You refer to the universal childcare system and the transformational change. I mean, what is the 10-year vision in terms of detail?
I mean, the detail is something, that we're working through just now. I think a very important development is the involvement of the Council of Economic Advisors, because we shouldn't undersell the economic gains, the economic benefits of childcare. Childcare isn't just a social issue or a women's issue. It's an infrastructure issue. It's imperative to our economy, and we should see, the two things in parallel. So I think it's important, as well as articulating the benefits to children of childcare and early learning in terms of their cognitive development, and in terms of the benefits to families and women. We should also be articulating the economic arguments. And if we look, just at the increase in employment rate of women from, say, 1992 to 2007, which went up from, the late 40s, around about 48% to 53%. I mean, that brought, in terms of, economic output, in terms of GVA, that adds about £8.5 billion pounds to the economy. So I do think we have to start marshalling some of the economic arguments for childcare. So in terms of the practicalities and addressing your question more directly, the Council of Economic Advisors will be looking very closely at international best practice. We've kind of focused in on 8 countries. We want to emulate the best, and we now need to look at models of provision, because there'll be a great debate about that, and also the funding of that provision. So we need to get into the guts of the model of provision and the funding of that provision, to establish what the next steps forward would be.
For interest, I don't suppose you have that list of 8 countries in front of you at the moment?
Certainly, many of them are European. I'm sure Denmark's on it. Can you remember any other ones, Susan?
Yeah, it's Scotland, UK, England, UK, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Slovenia, Netherlands and France.
Just before I move on to John Mason and his questions around schools, can I just pick up something else on the issue of childcare? And you'll know that one of the key issues that came out of the Women's Employment Summit was the lack of childcare for children up to the age of, say, 14. And it constantly frustrates me when we have conversations around childcare. We focus on preschool children, because provision of childcare for children up to 14 is a huge issue. So that's the first question I wanted to ask. What do you think can be done to increase provision of childcare for those older children?
Yeah,
Sorry, Minister. And the other issue that came out of the Women's Employment Summit was the number of women, and I know this from personal experience, there are large numbers of women clustered in, for example, the retail sector. There are large numbers of women that, because of changes in working patterns, are increasingly working a variety of different shifts, and there is no childcare available to them. So women are put in a position of either not being able to take up, say, extra hours or changing shifts and having to leave work because there is no childcare. And I would be interested in your views on how that can be solved, because if childcare is to become truly part of our infrastructure, we have to have a childcare system that doesn't just accommodate children up to the age of 5 and people that are working, say, from 8 in the morning to 6 at night. It has to cover the whole gamut of working timetables now.
Yes, I mean, that's part of the reason why we need to look at international best practice. I think it's a really good point in terms of older children, and it's one that we shouldn't forget, and we should also, in the lexicon of issues, be talking about things, like out of school care, breakfast clubs, wraparound care. I know in terms of the here and now, there's certainly been funds identified via the Third Sector Early Intervention Fund and some of the strategic partnership funding. and that comes under the auspices of Aileen Campbell, the Children's Minister, and that some of those funds have been targeted at out of school care provisions, and there's some significant organisations in that sector that we are funding. I think out of school care is particularly it's pertinent, but there are additional challenges in terms of rural areas where there is perhaps less of an infrastructure in terms of bricks and mortar. So we're looking at more innovative solution in terms of childminding, and of course childminding can be an enterprise for some women as well, or indeed some men. So the point is well made about older children. I think in terms of what we currently have, looking at 3 and 4-year-olds is the best place to start in terms of having the biggest impact. But you're absolutely right. This is far wider than just 3 and 4-year-olds, and you won't get any argument from me on that front. In terms of flexibility and the hours that childcare is available, that again is highly pertinent. There are many public sector workers I'm thinking about in the NHS, that will work weekends, will work out of hours, will have very early starts in the morning, and there aren't, I don't know, many nurseries who open, say, at 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever. So that's an additional challenge and barrier for parents having to, make quite intricate and specific arrangements. So, our aspiration, is for, affordable, accessible and flexible, and there are a huge amount of needs to consider. Is there anything you would like to add, Susan? There's also an organisation called CALA. They're a care and learning association, is that right? And a lot of their work tends to be in more rural parts of Scotland, looking at more bespoke solutions. Is there anything else you want to add? No, I think that covers it.
Thanks very much for that. I'm going to move now to John Mason, who has some issues around schools, and then Christian Allard, who's going to ask questions around the energy sector. John.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, I think to start off with, the role of schools when young people are choosing careers. Now, obviously, there's many factors as to why both boys and girls choose particular careers. There's their own experience, what their friends have done, what's done in that particular area they live in, their own families. And I just wonder what your feeling is about how much influence the schools can have in there.
I think schools do have a massive influence. Again, that would be stating the obvious. It's not rocket science. But I also believe with the changes in the curriculum that I think there are huge opportunities for us to capitalise there. I mean, the whole ethos change in curriculum for excellence is about contextualised learning and learning that is relevant to life and work. A lot of the work that I'm involved in as Minister for Youth Employment is about better connectivity between all phases of education and the world of work. So we do have a huge opportunity there to be preparing and informing young people better than ever before about the world of work. So that gives us the context and the opportunity to start to challenge stereotypes, to make sure that young women in particular have their eyes opened to the range of opportunities that are available. I think schools are important because we need to be engaging with young women in particular early. The earlier we engage with young people about potential career choices, the better. It's not about corralling them down one route or the other. But you know, if you're waiting until people have chosen subjects, you know, perhaps, you know, that's a little bit late. So in terms of a lot of the work with STEM ambassadors in primary schools, in terms of the work that we want to do with career-wise, and you know, young girls in particular, I think there are huge opportunities there, particularly with the you know, changes in with Curriculum for Excellence.
I mean, I agree we don't want to be corralling young people. I just sometimes get the feeling that we're actually at the other extreme, and that you know, a young person says, oh, well, I quite fancy doing that, and the school helps them doing that. But apparently sometimes without any knowledge or guidance as to where are the actually jobs at the end of the road. Because we've heard repeatedly there's jobs in engineering, there's jobs in the North Sea. And yet I meet young people who have gone through university and done some degree in politics or something. And the school did not seem to tell them, either boys or girls for that matter, that where the actual jobs were. And I just wonder if the school, I think it's maybe patchy a bit, because I think some schools are doing quite well. But my feeling is, and I don't know if it's your feeling, that some schools could be doing a bit more to really encourage young people along a direction.
That would be my feeling as well, Mr. Mason, in that, you know, there are you know, schools and some areas where there's great practice. I mean, I was in a primary school in my own constituency and was asked by an 11-year-old girl about modern apprenticeships, and you know, I could have sang with joy, but you know, but there are other experiences out there, and you know, one of the things that career-wise, you know, what wants to do is to really, you know, collaborate and, you know, see the extension of good practice. There is lots of, you know, quite specialist, you know, projects, examples out there, and we actually, to be fair to schools, we need to make it easier for them as well. There's a huge role for career services, but also for all teachers in terms of really informing young people. I mean, subjects, you know, are meant to be learned in the context of how they link with other subjects and how they link, you know, with real life learning, and that there's a huge opportunity there for all that learning to be linked with quite visible careers. I think we need to be also working with parents, because I think parents have a huge influence on choices. I mean, we know young people are influenced by their peers, but I think in terms of, you know, for example, you know, young women in STEM-related careers or careers in construction, you know, there's, you know, a lot of work we need to be doing with parents.
The career services, and that's clearly important, and especially if the young people have a relationship with the careers teachers, then they're going to presumably be guided by them. Is it important that we try and get more, well, women role models, but role models in general, into the schools? I mean, again, I think that's a bit patchy maybe, you know, but I mean, if kids see a woman engineer coming into the school, for example, or a woman police officer, that might encourage them to go down that route a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of how children learn, it is about quite often what they see and the images. You know, we have to be using education and the curriculum as a way, I suppose, to counter some of the more mass imaging that young people are exposed to in the media. I know that the construction's CITB, the construction's training board, and construction skills, you know, they have construction specific career advisors, but what we really need is for you know, all careers coaches to be conversant you know, with the labour market, and you know, to be able to challenge stereotypes and to give good advice as to where the jobs are today and where the jobs will be tomorrow. But I do think women role models are very powerful. I mean, we fund the Scottish Resource Centre for women in science and engineering technology. They're based at St Napier University, and you know, they do have done a lot of work in terms of promoting and actually supporting young women who are pursuing STEM careers. They have also sort of mapped where the good practice is where the gaps are, and that will be very helpful in terms of when we take forward career-wise. We're funding project workers as part of career-wise, and that's about trying to get some consistent level of activity in schools, and particularly in relation, I suppose, to oil and gas and energy. That shouldn't just be a phenomenon for schools in the northeast. So there's lots of work in terms of STEMIC, the kind of STEM Education Committee. I mean, they'll oversee career-wise, but one of the I suppose the beauties of the strategic group on women in work is that we can have a more overall view, and to try to get more overall change as opposed to piecemeal change here and there. But I mean, I hope to reassure committee, I mean, that this isn't just an issue that I'm pursuing as one minister. I mean, this agenda in terms of what happens in schools is very important to Dr Allen as the schools minister. We have Shona Robison, who's Commonwealth Games of Sport, but also the Equalities Minister. We've got the Children's Minister in Eileen Campbell, and there's myself. So there is a concerted cross-government effort to address some of these issues, whether it's about what's happening in school, childcare, or some of the broader occupational segregation issues.
Yes, and I mean, except today we're kind of expecting you to answer any question on anything, and in some cases it will be another minister who's more responsible, because the other side of the schools is the actual teachers and their working practices. And we have had witnesses, and the suggestion has been that although the part-time working is available in the schools, it's very inflexible, in fact, the way it all works. And either you get a half day, or you get a job share, or you get something like that, but there's not a lot of flexible working, which is actually what some people would want as much as part-time or full-time. I don't know if that's an area you feel you can say anything about, or if there could be any improvement in that area.
I'm sure there can always be improvements in that area. I'm probably not the best ministers to speak about, terms and conditions of teachers and working practices within schools. I do think it's important that, in terms of a teacher's continuous professional development, that part of that is about exposure to the world of work, and about what's happening, in employment fields and the labour market. Also, your question, the question I thought you were going to ask was actually about work experience, or just perhaps my tangential thinking, Mr Mason. But, I think we also have opportunities, whether it's, I suppose particularly within schools, to try and get more consistent work experience opportunities for young people. And there's a great opportunity to expose young women to different opportunities that they perhaps wouldn't have considered.
Okay, thanks. And the final area I kind of wanted to touch on was, I mean, it's been suggested to us as a committee that legislation might be part of the answer in all this, and I'd like you to maybe confirm it. Would all the legislation in this area have to be at Westminster? For example, a job being advertised would have to be advertised part-time or as a flexible possibility. My assumption is that would be Westminster legislation rather than Scottish, but you could maybe confirm that. But you also said in your opening remarks, we can lead by example. Now, the suggestion would then be, could we say that all the public service jobs in Scotland that we are responsible for would have to be available part-time or flexible unless there was a very good reason otherwise? Is that something that we could do?
I think in terms of the Scottish Government as an employer, I think there are many areas in which we do lead by example. The one that springs to mind would be on the living wage. And I certainly know, in terms of going about my work as a minister, that there are many officials who I work with that you know, you see the emails that, you know, the days that they're not available and the times that they're not available. And, you know, so there's an example of flexible working and that many of those women officers, that's to do with, you know, their family commitments. So I think as an employer, we can lead by example. Some of the issues...
Across the public sector?
Probably not. I mean, you know, we could... I mean, without looking at a kind of detailed audit of who does what, I think there will be variances across the public sector. And, you know, many of the employment issues will be employment issues for local authorities. But as employment law is reserved, I mean, the scope that we have as a government is to lead by example as an employer. And to, I suppose, use our role as in government and all our engagement with the private sector, you know, to try and promote and encourage cultural changes. And I think a lot of that is about marshalling arguments around you know, diverse workforces, flexible working, and actually how that is good for business. And that's about, you know, if we are underutilising more than half the population, and we have, you know, some industries and some sectors who are facing the issue of skill shortages, there's a role for government to help match better, or to help help people into work, and to help companies sort out their skill shortages. So in the context of that, there are, you know, opportunities to you know, pursue an agenda. And I suppose a more concrete example, without trying to stray off the subject too much, although, you know, this issue is so interrelated, and this is one of the challenges we've had on the strategic group with women in work, is to, you know, get streams of work and, you know, to be able to start to bite things off in a practical sense, because it is all quite circular and interrelated. But the concrete example I could give is that the Energy Skills Advisory Group is working with the industry leadership groups on doing a refresh of the skills investment plan. Now, a skills investment plan, there's a skills investment plan for many of the key growth sectors in their economy, and that's about how you know, government works with industry to help them meet their workforce and skills needs. So in the refresh of that energy skills investment plan, you know, there is now a dialogue about gender and how are we going to get more women you know, into oil and gas, and how do we get more women into renewables, you know, a fairly new industry. How do we, you know, start off in that industry on a better footing? So I hope there are more concrete examples of what you know, this government can currently
point
do.
that you know, it's one big picture and we've got to start somewhere and all the rest of it, because I think we have heard from witnesses that too many employers, and this is private, public, right across, you know, they think in kind of 40-hour slots, and so they're thinking of somebody, oh, we need somebody for 40 hours, but maybe they need somebody for 20 hours or 30 hours or whatever, and just the whole system needs a bit of a, you know, a move, I think, is what we've felt. Okay, thanks so much.
Supplementary from Marco Biaggi.
Yeah, just developing on that, there was a very, very specific proposal that at the point of advertising any job in the public sector, it should be advertised proactively as part-time and flexible, potentially, so as to get over the problem of people being afraid to ask. Do you think that is something that has merit and something you might look at?
I think there are many jobs that there are no practical reason why it couldn't be job share or flexible working or part-time, and I suppose you know, it is often easier just to, you know, trundle down the same old tried and tested route of you know, seeking what you've always sought when you're advertising for jobs. So yes, I mean, you know, how could we, you know, promote better practice and a more openness to looking at the alternatives, you know, across you know, the public sector. I mean, we're not, you know, we're one public sector employer, so but you know, I think, you know, there is an important direction of travel there. Is there anything, Eileen, in terms of as a public sector employer, in terms of our own practices that we could do to encourage other public sector or private sector employers as well?
I was just wondering as well, also the public sector equality duty and the specific Scottish regulations. There's been a very strong movement by authorities and organisations covered by that to look at their own staffing policies. And also many have developed an outcome around their staffing. I think that's something that the Commission will be able to develop as those kind of bed in and look at. And they're obviously, as an organisation ourselves, we have a number of outcomes that we're working towards around equality. And a few of them are actually about our own staff. And I know, for example, the Police Scotland has an equality outcome just around their staffing and how they're going to develop the diversity of their workforce, and I think that will be replicated, and that will be something that can be quite obviously measured in relation to the indicators that sit under those outcomes and how staff can be the diversity of the staff can be looked at. So I think that will be something in the future years that we can use as a benchmark and move forward as well.
Christian Allard has some questions around the energy sector, and then I'll move to John Finney with questions about the process, and I suspect a few more questions around the crossover of portfolios. Christian.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm delighted that you've been talking about the energy sector so much so far this morning. And what I would like to ask is what actions the Scottish Government has taken so far. I agree with John Mason. I think that it's a bit patchy, particularly in the schools. And how you see your role and the role of the Scottish Government, how to give the same opportunity for every child, and particularly for young women to enter the industry. I'm particularly thinking, what's your role, interaction with local authorities? How can local authorities all over Scotland can have maybe the same system, how to engage with the energy sector, which is now opening offices all over Scotland, and it's not only in the northeast. So I would like to know what is your role, what has been done so far, and what is the pipeline.
I mean, I've already mentioned about the work that the Energy Skills Action Group is doing in terms of liaison with industry, in terms of refreshing the skills investment plan, and I think that's an important example about how we've, in the context of meeting skill shortages, that we've been able to promote the gender issue and women's opportunity to participate in careers in energy. I think another important development is that the renewables route map will be subject to an equality impact assessment, and that we will be publishing and monitoring the number of entrants into the renewable sector. In terms of local authorities, again, that's about our work with schools, and is building on the new opportunities of contextualised learning for the curriculum for excellence. I think there are some specific opportunities in and around the senior phase, in that it creates the opportunity for more personalised learning, and combine that with the added value of career services and such like. We also need to, in terms of local authorities and schools, we need to be more consistently promoting vocational education and the modern apprenticeship programme in particular. But I think it is important to emphasise that if you're looking for systemic change, it's lots of change at every part of the process. So we do need to start better engagement with young girls before they're making subject choices. And then what we're doing in the senior phase of the curriculum is important. And then how women are supported through STEM subjects, and then you know, into STEM or oil and gas, you know, careers, because we all know of the leaky pipeline.
As a Minister for Youth Employment, you see your role as early as primary schools?
But in terms of my role as the Youth Employment Minister, I suppose I'm also in effect the Skills Minister. So I do have, you know, an interest, you know, out with the age range 16 to 24. So it seems part of my job to be engaging with industry along with Fergus Ewan about, you know, their specific skills needs.
I move to John Finney with questions around process, and then Alex Johnson, who has some questions around women's employment in rural areas. John.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, as the Convener said, I was going to ask you questions about process and the fact that much of what we've discussed and many of your answers cut across portfolios. I wonder if I can give you three pieces of information, if you can tell me if they're one and the same. We had a letter from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in which he talks about, and I quote here, specifically in relation to gender, officials are exploring with EBAG, the Equality Budget Advisory Group, how to improve the Scottish Government's economic modelling to better reflect the nature of women's employment and women's position in the economy. Now, also, if I noted you correctly, and I may not have, not least because of my handwriting, I thought you referred to the Cross-Directorate on Occupational Segregation Group. And of course, you have made a number of mentions of the small group which is taking forward the priorities on from the Women's Employment Summit. Are they all one and the same? Is the small group, and I'm seeing shaking heads there, is the small group then cross-directorate? Because that seemed to me to be very important.
Right. Let me start from the top. At a broad strategic all-government level, we've got the strategic group on women and work, and that's it's chaired by myself, but it's the membership is independent, and all the members are women, and on that group we've got Professor Alice Brown, Professor Sarah Carter, Professor Ailsa Mackay, industry representation in the form of Marjorie Strachan and Caroline Stewart. They're from Oracle and the Royal Bank of Scotland. STUC representation, Anne Henderson, Anne Douglas, and Save the Children in terms of Claire Telfer. So that's very quite a small group covering, you know, sort of academic, business, third sector. And that's to oversee the work from the Women's Employment Summit. And that group, that independent group, will also oversee and inform my reports to Parliament about progress. It's small, but let me start from the top, because I think that's the group that has the all-arching purpose to take forward the many recommendations from the Women's Employment Summit. Now, the Women's Employment Summit had 6 commissions that covered childcare, enterprise, occupational segregation, multiple obstacles and barriers to work, workforce issues, research and analysis issues, and there was also you know, a bit of work on rural discussions. So that is absolutely massive. It's a huge jigsaw with many small pieces. So there needs to be, I suppose, at a top level, somebody that oversees all of that work. Now, we won't do all of that work at nitty-gritty level. So, but somebody needs to be at the top to oversee the direction of travel. Now, if underneath that, I don't mean to be hierarchical about it, it's probably the most simplest way of explaining, the cross-directorate group on occupational segregation. Now that it's got representation from, you know, various portfolios in government, and that will take forward all the issues in and around occupational segregation, many of which came from the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Tapping All Our Talents report. And while that report was very focused on STEM, issues, actually the issues that they were talking about in relation to STEM, apply elsewhere. So you've got the strategic group, Women in Work, and then you've got the cross-directorate occupational segregation working group that will do, quite focused but in-depth bit of work on that. But there's also the work of the Early Years Task Force, which is driving forward the childcare work. So we will, link in with the work that they are doing. What Mr Swinney is talking about is a long-standing arrangement that this government has always exposed, or there's always been that scrutiny of a budget equality impact assessment on our budget, which is an important bit of work that kind of feeds into all aspects of government. But in terms of groups, you've got the Women in Work strategic group and the Early Years Task Force, which will, in terms of childcare, they'll take forward that work, but it will feed in. There'll be links, and then there's the cross-directorate occupational segregation working group to get into the guts of that issue. I really hope that's clear.
Well, actually, it's reinforced what my main interest in it is, and that is the level of coordination between these. I mean, these are massive tasks, and there's no doubt there's a lot of good work ongoing. I think in the past, in other areas, people have their head down doing their own thing. So it's the pulling together aspect that I'm interested in, and particularly, Minister, with regard to childcare. I mean, the issues that have been picked up about education, so shaping people's minds early on. You mentioned the Children's Minister. I'm particularly interested, there was a very brief reference from yourself to the Industry Minister. It would seem to me the Industry Minister would be a key player in this as well. Are you able to comment on that?
No, I mean, absolutely. In terms of the work that Fergus Ewing does, for example, both Fergus Ewing and I, have been engaging with the energy sector and the oil and gas sector with regards to skills shortages and the opportunities for that industry, in terms of creating more pathways and opportunities for women to start their careers in that industry, or in terms of women returners. So it is very much an all-government approach, because it has to be.
If I can maybe move to another subject there, it's certainly my view that the UK government's mounting an unprecedented attack not only on vulnerable people through the welfare reform, but with proposals relating to hard fought for workers' rights, with the so-called Share for Rights issue. Now, it's my understanding that one of these is the high-profile one is access to employment tribunal to trade that for shares. There's an issue about flexible working being one of those. Have you had any involvement with that at all? Would the Scottish Government make representations on that? Because it would seem to me that a lot of good work that could be ongoing here could be undermined, albeit for a short period, hopefully, with some of these.
The Scottish Government, has been making representations to the UK Government in terms of, and this has been, Mr Ewing's been the conduit to that, in terms of the issue about people giving up some of their employment rights for shares in a company. And that's either been Mr Ewing or Mr Swinney that certainly corresponded to the UK Government on that point.
Correspondence, please. I'll share
it's
with
not my
committee.
correspondence, but I'm
Okay.
sure. I'm sure in terms of openness and transparency, I'm sure we could
Thank you.
share that. And just let me think. There's no conventions about ministerial letters between ministers being shared, is there? We'll check that out. We'll check that out.
If it's within the rules.
So I'm just
Yes, thank you.
don't want to bring horse and cart over convention. But yeah, I mean, it would be our desire to be as open as possible about these things, because while the John Lewis model of working in terms of their employees having a share in the company, that's quite a productive model, but those employees aren't doing it at the expense of their working rights. But there's definitely been a view from this government communicated to the UK government with regards to that.
Well, that's an attack on workers' terms and conditions. Now, Unison and the RCN have called for legislation defining a right to flexible working to make it more difficult for employers to refuse requests. Is that something the Scottish Government would support in representations to the UK Government?
Well, certainly what we are doing just now, I mean, as you'll know, the STUC have regular meetings with the First Minister at the very top of government, and I know that they'll be meeting very soon, early June, you know, where they will be discussing a range of labour market issues, and you know, as we progress you know, with our constitutional work, you know, we'll be you know, given a view of our sort of framework for employment law, and you know, and in due course we'll give a, you know, sort of a party political view, but in terms of the economic case for independence and the paper that was published earlier in the week, it spoke of I suppose a more sort of social partnership approach about how government, just a suggestion about how government could be working more collaboratively with the trade union movement and employers, again at that strategic level, and having a national employment rights agency akin to what's available in Ireland. Now, these are, you know, suggestions, but I'm just sort of pointing to that, you know, there's a reference, you know, to that area of employment law in that paper that was produced earlier this week, or published earlier this week.
Okay, that's very reassuring. Finally, if I may, Convener, Unison want the Scottish Government to amend legislation to introduce equal pay audits. Again, is that something that there would be support for?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, in terms of, you know, my understanding of equal pay audits is that that's about understanding the causes of the pay gap, and just now, because of the specific duties that the Scottish Government brought in 2012, that followed the Equality Act from the UK Government in 2010. The UK Government brought in the due regard to tackling discrimination and promoting equality. On the back of that, the Scottish Government brought in some quite specific duties for the public sector. Aileen mentioned them earlier. That's in terms of publishing information about the pay gap, that it was about how people can evidence that they're mainstreaming equality, and you know, the reporting on progress every few years, and obviously as a government we've done that in terms of, you know, our own practices recently. So, you know, we are keen to look at everything in the mix, and you know, would be happy to discuss you know, proposals of that ilk with all our stakeholders, both with trade union colleagues and with industry, you know, to find out, you know, how you would go about doing that. I assume industry colleagues would want to be reassured that it wasn't over onerous, but at the same time it is important to understand the causes and what really drives the gender pay gap.
Supplementary from Marco Biaggi.
Just on the process issue, now that Shona Robison has responsibility for equalities, and I believe we were told it was most equalities, where does she fit in the ministerial coordination of this? Because I thought her position was a cross-cutting equalities. Are you retaining gender in work as an area of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I'll you know, will retain, you know, a portfolio responsibility for you know, women in work, you know, and Shona, I'll have the broader equalities, and I suppose that, you know, equalities encapsulates, women in work. I mean, I don't.
Her then.
Well, we'll both be reporting to the First Minister and their respective cabinet secretaries.
But would it be the case then that in future the point of coordination of cross-government action on gender issues would be the Minister for Commonwealth Games, Sport and Equalities, or whatever she gets called, and you would focus on the work area?
I will have more of a focus on work, but and Shona Robinson, will be, leading, everything that encapsulates equalities. But I mean, I think it's, important to understand that, we have good cross-portfolio work in government, and we have to, in terms of reaching, the best solutions. But also, you have to practice what you preach. I mean, we're asking, the rest of the world, to collaborate and work together. So we have to show that we can do likewise.
Alex Johnson, on questions around women in rural areas.
Thank you very much. I think the Minister suggested earlier that one of our officials who accompany her today may have some information on rural issues. So I wanted to introduce broadly, the first question I have to ask is that as we discuss women in work, and we do it in a general sense, are there any specific issues that are examples of where there are differences or additional difficulties in a rural environment for women seeking employment?
I think, as a general comment, every issue that affects women in work will have a rural dimension to it. Any issue I think that you care to mention will have a rural dimension to it.
Moving to a more specific point, the need for training for potential new entrants to rural industries is fairly obvious, but over recent years there has been, for more than one reason, a decline in the availability of specialist training for rural industries, particularly in agriculture and land management courses, for example, which are not as easily obtainable as they once were, and also tourism, which is becoming a more important industry in rural Scotland. The fact that we don't have the same opportunity for people to train in rural industries will have an across-the-board effect, but will that have a disproportionate effect on women who want to train to work in rural industries?
Well, the opportunities that we have, in broad terms, there's the Employability Fund, and the Employability Fund, in terms of how that's spent, is decided at a local level. Employability Fund replaces Scottish Government's pre-employment training, and we brought together Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland pre-employability funding, and it's decisions about how that's spent is made at a local level so that it can respond to local labour markets and the skill needs in a local community. So if, where tourism's an issue, that should be reflected in terms of the employability spend on that area. And, there is also, given that tourism is a key area of economic growth, there either will be or is a skills investment plan for that. So we need to make sure that the needs of women, and whether it's women returners work or women getting into that industry, are appropriately reflected.
Deliver education and training for rural industries near enough to the industries themselves? The reason why I'm concerned about that is that we all know that one of the key drivers for the loss of young people from rural communities is that they head off, they go to university and they enter into careers that cause them never to come back. But there's a certain irony in the fact that we're in a position today where if you want to train in a rural skill or to enter a rural industry that exists in your own backyard, if you then have to leave home to train in that industry, then half the battle is lost before we even get to it.
I mean, certainly, in terms of the discussions that was had at the Women's Employment Summit, in terms of the rural discussions, from Dumfries and Inverness. I mean, certainly the issues of depopulation, and as you described, young people, leaving for their education. I suppose the balance of that is in terms of industries that are important, and the rural industries are important, but in terms of creating provision to meet the skill needs, you're needing numbers, to participate in a course or whatever. But in terms of some of the work that Mr. Russell and Dr. Allen do in terms of more flexible learning, making use of technology, I mean, there are opportunities there, although I take the point in terms of agriculture and some rural industries, there is a need to be more hands-on. I mean, there'll be a need for experiential learning as opposed to, computer-based or classroom learning.
Certainly the issue you touch on there is exactly the same as the one that was pointed out by John Mason earlier, that we have this difficulty in that quite often inappropriate course choices leads to the loss of the courses that we actually need. And I think in terms of agriculture and rural land-based training, that's exactly what we've suffered from in recent years. But my main concern on this is that we are perhaps driving depopulation in some areas, and that there may even be, as a result of the willingness of women to participate in some rural industries, a tendency for that depopulation to be disproportionate between the sexes, especially at a younger age. Moving on to a slightly different subject, you did touch on it earlier, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say a little more on the subject, if you thought it was appropriate, and that is the issues of childcare as they affect women in work in rural environments.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. We know that we know that childcare's a massive issue, across the country, but there are some particularly acute challenges in rural areas, and some of that is to do, with the population mass, and therefore, the need for more individual solutions. I think there is a need to promote more childminding, out of school care, and definitely, and I suppose for the more extreme rural areas, that there will be issues in terms of access to nursery provision for 3 and 4 year olds. Susan, in terms of some of the specific action points with regards to that stream of work.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. What the Minister mentioned earlier is what we find in the rural areas is there's need for more innovative solutions to childcare. And that's why we've put funding in through the Third Sector Fund and the Strategic Funding Partnerships to organisations like CALA, which is Care and Learning Alliance. So not only do they deliver more flexible solutions like staff banks and different types of childcare, flexible childcare, they also support other organisations who want to develop, and they help with social enterprise models. So the funding will help them to do that nationally, what they've done really successfully in Highlands and in Murray. That's also, as the Minister said, why we fund Scottish Childminders Association. Again, they provide more flexibility in rural areas, and they can provide community childminding. There's also been a recent report published, which I can't remember the name of. It was an Education Rural Commission report, and it made recommendations in relation to rural areas and early learning and childcare, and a lot of it was about integrating services and having community hubs, so that one out of school care might cover 3 or 4 different primaries, and trying to cluster services and integrate services to make them more accessible and more viable and sustainable. So we'll be looking at the recommendations of that report as well.
Is there anything you could say at this point about the difficulties relating to extreme sparsity of population? Because, of course, there are large areas of Scotland we describe as rural, where the population's relatively dense in rural terms, but also there are other areas, particularly in Perthshire and the Highlands and others, where there is very low population densities. Is there a population density beyond which there is little we can do to help in terms of childcare provision?
I suppose one of the things that I would like to see, and and I mentioned that the rural dimension runs through every issue and every stream of work, and we didn't want to, if you like, segregate rural work. We wanted to try and embed the rural issues to all the other work that was going on. But there are, some opportunities in terms of, women in enterprise and supporting the development of social enterprise would seem to be, one way of helping overcome, some of the challenges. We have an issue of women being underrepresented in terms of start-ups. In terms of being self-employed, setting up businesses, and it would seem to me that we have issues in terms of reach, in terms of areas that are sparsely populated, in terms of services for children. I don't want to assume that it should always be women that do the start-up in childcare or family service type related work. It may well often be, but I don't want to make that assumption, but it did, there is we're trying to get an alignment instead of looking at problems in isolation, and some of the issues about access to childcare in extremely rural areas, we could, if we get some of the solutions right and promoting enterprise and women in enterprise, we might manage to overcome some of that imaginatively. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask a further question on apprenticeships? Apprenticeships play a key role in getting young people into work and into training, not just young women, young men. So it kind of follows on that the apprenticeships could also play a key role in breaking down gender segregation. But we know from evidence that we've heard that women make up only 1% of building apprentices. And equally in the childcare and caring sector, there is a very low take-up of men into those apprenticeships. So what is being done to use the apprenticeship scheme to break down gender segregation, and what more would you like to see done in apprenticeships?
Absolutely. And I mean, while it's important to acknowledge that the overall numbers of women participating in the modern apprenticeship programme generally are vastly improved. It's went from 27% to 43% since 08-09. And in terms of actual numbers, I mean, 08-09, it was 2,857, and in the most recent year, we've had over 11,000 women participate in the modern apprenticeship scheme, as part of the overall ramping up of numbers, and that's important. It's important to acknowledge that, but it's also very important equally to acknowledge that when you start looking at different age groups, when you start looking at different frameworks, you will see a vast difference, and you will see the two extremes from construction. 1.3% of MEs are women in construction, and whereas it'll be almost 99% of MEs in childcare are women, and that is something that we do very much want to address. I don't think there's a quick solution. I wouldn't like to lead anybody to believe that it'll be sorted by this time next year. But Skills Development Scotland are doing an equality action plan, and I've asked them to you know, look at, and I'm not one for pilot-itis, but I do think, you know, that there is a need for a pilot here, and you know, I'm discussing with them some ideas, you know, in and around that, you know, which sector, you know, that pilot should be in. It won't necessarily be a pilot just for young women. I think I'm quite attracted at this stage to a pilot that could also look at childcare issues. You know, so you know, there is a lot more work that needs to be done there. The success of the Modern Apprenticeship Programme is its employed status, and that's what marks us out from other apprenticeship programmes, and it's what leads to sustainable employment. You know, we know that people that complete an apprenticeship, you know, over 90% of them 6 months later will be in work. We know that nearly 80% will be in full-time work. So in that sense, we know the model works. So we don't, I would be very opposed to playing around with the employed status. But we do have to find ways to get more women into particular sectors. The position for women over 25 is more stark. And that's, you know, one of the things I'm interested in is how we get more women into, you know, key areas of economic growth that are part of the government's economic strategy. So we will look at, you know, a pilot in and around that. There is an action plan. I'm aware that in Poland, they have had great success in getting more young women into their technical schools. Now, their education system's different, but they've went from getting technical schools, you know, historically had 20-25% of girls in them. They've now got that up to 50%. So I'm interested as to how they've achieved that, because when I met the EU Rapporteur on Youth Employment, who's MEP from Poland, I mean, she was saying that largely was done by sort of positive image campaigning, and they now have parents banging at the door wanting to send their girls to, you know, the vocational education school, because it leads to jobs and outcomes, and you know, the economy in Poland, and in terms of youth employment, as they have some even more stark challenges than we have. So I think there's, you know, a lot we can do. I don't think we've hit on the solution with regards to that yet. I think that the MA programme reflects the workplace. And, you know, so there's also a body of work to be done with employers. And, you know, wherever I go, you know, when I visit MEs, whether it's at training providers or with employers, you know, I'm always asking, and what are you doing to encourage girls? But we do need to, you know, increase the profile of the Modern Apprenticeship Programme in schools across the piece. So there is a desire, you know, on my behalf to, you know, again to address that, and to do it in a meaningful way that's not going to lead to the programme having poorer outcomes.
Would it be possible for committee to be updated on the Equality Action Plan as it progresses along? I think it would be very useful for us to be kept up to date on that.
Definitely.
Do committee members have any further questions for the Minister? Christian.
Yes, I would like to add something. I'm new in the committee. I had to look in my papers and see what kind of witnesses came in front of committee. And one thing I was concerned about is the impact on welfare reforms. And if the UK government had made an assessment, if you know if the UK government has made an assessment regarding a young woman and women at work and lone parents, and how you see yourself as the Scottish Government, if you have any plans to mitigate on this?
I mean, the whole welfare reform agenda is huge. It's subject to very heated debates. Members will be aware of the breadth of work that this government is doing. You know, there are you know, examples of where, you know, we have been able to mitigate, you know, cuts to council tax benefit. You know, we worked with local authorities to help over 500,000 Scots. I think Mr Allard has pointed to a significant issue in terms of lone parents. I think it's with a child over 5 being moved from income support to job seekers job seekers allowance, although that will all change with universal credit. So the situation is very, very complex. And you know, for me personally, I think women should have the choice whether they stay at home and look after their child or whether they work. And that doesn't take away from the fact that, well, I'm a working mother, so that shows my preference. As an employment minister, I know we need to increase women's participation in the labour market. But personally, I'm always cautious about, you know, I suppose intervening on decisions for individual parents and individual families when, you know, we don't know the needs of their particular child. Some of these children will be disabled. So I also think, as part of it's a careful balance, a part of our agenda in increasing the participation of women in the labour force, and we need to do that, you know, for equality, but also for, you know, the sake of our economy, because we're really missing a trick here. We also need to value, you know, women who stay at home and who work in the home and who work to raise their family. So, you know, I suppose that's just my word of caution. We know that the money that's been taken out of the system will be £4.5 billion from 2011 to 2015, and we know that will have more of an adverse impact on equality groups. But I don't want to take advantage of the committee's good humour, but, you know, the constitutional arguments do play here, and I would much rather have powers over welfare rather than not have powers over welfare.
Any further questions from committee? In that case, can I thank the Minister and witnesses for coming along this morning and giving us your evidence. And that concludes the public part of today's meeting. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday, the 30th of May, and will include ministerial evidence on the Marriage Same-Sex Couple Bill LCM and consideration of our draft annual report. And I'm now going to suspend the meeting before we move into private session. We'll reconvene at 5 to 11.